Okay, so get ready for this one. Today we're diving deep into the life of a guy named William Wilberforce. You might not know the name right away, but stick with me, his story is incredible. We're talking about someone who took on the huge EE system of the slave trade and actually helped bring about its end in the British Empire. We're talking about really making a difference.
Yeah, and what makes it even more amazing is that he did all of this when slavery was like totally normal in Britain. It was like built into their everyday life, not some faraway problem. It was part of everything, the economy, their culture.
Yeah, and you're right. That is what makes this story so powerful. We've got two sources for this deep dive, a biography on Wilberforce, and then this proposed podcast episode outline all about his resilience. It's really interesting to see how different perspectives can shine a light on the same person, huh?
Absolutely. It's like a reminder that history is not just dates and names. It's about understanding how complicated the past was and how people dealt with it all. So let's start with the basics. Who was William Wilberforce?
Well, he was born in Hull, England back in 1759. And by 1780, he was already a member of Parliament. He was only 21. But then things get really interesting. Around 1785, he had this big religious conversion. It seems like this was a turning point for him, like it really fueled his passion for social justice.
Now, to really get what Wilberforce was up against, we have to understand how much slavery was just a normal part of life in 18th century Britain. I mean, owning slaves wasn't seen as bad by a lot of people. It was actually a symbol of being wealthy and important. Merchants, investors, even the church, they were all making money from this system.
So it wasn't just like he was fighting an idea. He was taking on the whole foundation of British society. That must have taken some serious courage.
Totally. And in 1787, he teamed up with other abolitionists, people like Thomas Clarkson, who was collecting firsthand accounts of the horrors of the slave trade, and Granville Sharp, who was fighting for the legal rights of slaves in England. Together, they became this powerful force for change.
Wow. So it wasn't a one-man show. He had this whole network of people who believed in the same thing.
That's fascinating. Did this group have a name or something? Did they operate under a certain banner?
They did. They were known as the Clapham sect, a group of reformers all living in the Clapham area of London. What's really interesting about them is that they didn't just talk about change. They actively came up with strategies, lobbied Parliament, raised public awareness, and even funded efforts to help slaves.
Hold on, we're not just talking moral support here. We're talking about a whole organized movement working behind the scenes. That definitely changes how you think about their influence.
You got it. And their efforts, combined with Wilberforce's passionate speeches in Parliament, started to really change the public's opinion. But it was a long, hard fight. It took 20 years of nonstop campaigning, setbacks, political maneuvering, and fierce opposition from those who were profiting from the slave trade.
2 decades. It's hard to wrap your head around that. What did that even look like? What kind of obstacles did they come up against? Well, imagine this. Wilberforce brings an abolition bill to Parliament, and it gets rejected year after year. Pro-slavery groups start these smear campaigns, saying abolitionists are radicals, that they would ruin the British economy. And the West India lobby, this powerful group of plantation owners, use their money and influence to block any progress. It was a relentless battle against some very powerful people.
Wow, it's incredible that he never gave up. So how did they finally make a breakthrough? What was the turning point?
Well, there wasn't one single event, more like a series of strategic moves and a shift in public opinion. The abolitionists used everything they could. Public lectures, pamphlets, they even organized sugar boycotts to raise awareness about the horrors of the slave trade. Clarkson's accounts of the conditions on slave ships really shocked the British public. And then there was this growing movement among evangelical Christians who saw slavery as a sin.
So it sounds like they created this perfect storm of pressure on the government. So when did they finally get that first big win?
Yeah, it all came together in 1807 with the passage of the Slave Trade Act. Think about that. After 20 years of fighting, Wilberforce and his allies managed to abolish the slave trade in the entire British Empire. This was huge, but Wilberforce didn't stop there.
He didn't. I thought ending the slave trade was the ultimate goal. What else was there to fight for?
Well, remember, the 1807 Act only outlawed the trade of slaves, not slavery itself. So it was illegal to buy and sell new slaves. But the people who were already enslaved, they were still stuck. Wilberforce knew the fight wasn't over. He wanted to see slavery completely abolished in all the British colonies.
So this guy, after dedicating decades of his life to this cause, decides to push for even more. That's remarkable.
It really is. And it makes you wonder what drove him. We know about his religious conversion and his network of supporters, but what else contributed to his incredible moral strength?
Well, one of the sources mentioned something really interesting, his friendship with Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger. Apparently they were really close, but they had completely different views on slavery.
It really is a fascinating contrast, their friendship. Can you imagine being close friends with the most powerful person in the country, but disagreeing with him on something as fundamental as this?
I know, it's like something out of a movie. You'd think he would have just gone along to get along,
Yeah.
you know? Especially with Pitt having so much political power.
Right, and that's what's so remarkable about Wilberforce. He just refused to compromise his beliefs, even if it meant risking his friendship with the prime minister. The sources say their debates about slavery were really intense, but somehow their friendship survived.
Wow, that says a lot about both of them. Like, they had this deep respect for each other, even though they disagreed. But it also makes me wonder, how did these conversations even happen? Did they argue at dinner parties? Or were there late-night policy clashes going on?
Well, the sources don't give us the specifics of their conversations, but you can just imagine the tension. Wilberforce with Clarkson's reports and his own moral convictions, challenging Pitt, who probably argued for a slower approach, talking about the economy and political realities.
It must have taken so much courage to stand up to him like that, especially knowing that Pitt could ruin his career. Did the sources say anything about how Pitt reacted to Wilberforce's stance?
They don't really go into Pitt's feelings, but they do talk about his complicated relationship with the abolition movement. I mean, Pitt was personally against slavery, but he faced a lot of resistance from his own party, so he had to be careful. Some historians even think that Wilberforce's constant pressure on him actually pushed Pitt to take a stronger stance, even if it was behind the scenes.
So maybe it wasn't just about changing the law, but about changing people's minds at the highest levels of power, this whole idea of moral resilience. It's more than just believing in something strongly. It's about actually acting on your beliefs, even when it's hard.
Yeah, exactly. It's about staying true to what you believe, even when you're facing pressure, setbacks, or personal attacks. Just think about Wilberforce's 20-year struggle. It would have been so easy to give up or compromise. To just say, well, I tried my best, but he didn't.
He didn't. And it all paid off. First with the Slave Trade Act in 1807. And then amazingly, with the total abolition of slavery in 1833, just 3 days before he died. It's like he was holding on, just waiting for that final victory.
That's a really powerful image. It shows how deeply committed he was to this cause, but it also highlights another key part of his success: his ability to adapt and change his approach over time. He didn't just stick to one strategy. He was always evolving, finding new ways to push the cause forward.
So it wasn't just about passion, it was about being strategic and understanding politics. Is that what you mean by evolving?
Exactly. In the beginning, he focused on moral arguments, appealing to people's consciences. But when he hit roadblocks, he realized he needed a more complex approach. He started working with economists to debunk the pro-slavery economic arguments. And he worked with activists like Clarkson to gather evidence of the horrors of the slave trade.
He was really playing the long game. It's fascinating how he combined moral conviction with such a strategic mind.
Absolutely. And there's another part of Wilberforce's story we haven't talked about yet: his commitment to social reform in general. He wasn't just focused on ending slavery. That fight was part of a bigger vision for a more just and compassionate society.
You mentioned earlier how the sources list all these other causes he was involved in. Things like the Society for the Suppression of Vice, missionary work in India, even the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. At first, it seemed like a random collection of interests.
Yeah, but if you look closer, there's a common thread: this deep concern for the vulnerable and marginalized, a belief in human dignity, and a commitment to using his power to help those who couldn't help themselves.
So it wasn't just random causes. It was all part of a larger ethical framework. That's a really interesting way to look at it.
It is, and it reminds us that real social change often requires a broader approach, tackling interconnected problems and getting to the root causes. Wilberforce understood that ending slavery was just one step towards creating a truly just society.
So it wasn't just about dismantling one evil system. He was actually trying to build a better world. It makes you think about all the challenges we face today, all these complex issues that need more than simple solutions.
Exactly. Like climate change, poverty, social inequality. These are all connected challenges that need a Wilberforce-like approach, combining moral conviction with strategic thinking, collaboration, and the willingness to challenge those in power.
This is making me think about what I can do. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by these problems, to feel like one person can't make a difference.
That's where Wilberforce's story gives us hope. It reminds us that even one person with conviction and resilience can make a difference, even against incredible odds.
But where do we even start? How do we apply his lessons to our own lives? What does it mean to be a Wilberforce in the 21st century?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? It's easy to look at a guy like Wilberforce and think, well, he was extraordinary. I could never do that. Right, I get that. But I think that misses a really important point. Wilberforce's story isn't just about these huge victories. It's also about the smaller, everyday acts of courage.
You mean like speaking out against injustice,
Yeah.
even when it's uncomfortable, or sticking up for someone who's being treated unfairly?
Exactly. It's all about the ripple effect. These small actions can inspire others, build momentum, and eventually lead to bigger changes in society.
So maybe it's not about becoming the next William Wilberforce, but about finding our own ways to live by his example, his dedication to justice, his persistence, his belief in the power of people working together.
I like that. And remember, Wilberforce didn't do it all on his own. He had his faith, his friends, his network of allies. They gave him support, encouragement, and helped him strategize.
Oh yeah, the Clapham sect. This amazing group of reformers who are all in it for the long run. It makes me think about how easy it is to connect with like-minded people today. Online communities, local groups, even our own friends and family. We can all build our own Clapham sects.
That's a great way to put it, because having that support system is so important. Fighting for change can be exhausting, even discouraging sometimes. But knowing you're not alone, that there are people who believe in you and what you're doing, it makes all the difference.
It's like having your own personal cheer squad, pushing you to keep going when you want to quit. And I think that's one of the most inspiring things about Wilberforce's story. It reminds us that even in the darkest times, there's always hope. There's always a reason to keep fighting for a better world.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that Wilberforce wasn't perfect. He made mistakes, he had his flaws, he even had his own internal struggles, but he never forgot his values, and he never let setbacks define him.
It's kind of comforting to know that even someone who achieved so much wasn't this flawless superhero. He was human, just like us.
Exactly. And that makes his story even more relatable and inspiring. It shows us that we don't have to be saints to make a difference. We just have to be willing to try, to keep learning, to keep showing up, and to keep fighting for the change we want to see.
You know, at the beginning of this deep dive, I said I didn't know much about William Wilberforce. But now, I'm really blown away by him. His story is both humbling and empowering.
It's amazing how these deep dives can introduce us to these hidden figures from history. People who might not be famous, but whose lives offer us so many valuable lessons.
So as we wrap up our exploration of William Wilberforce, I want to leave you with one final thought, something to think about. What cause or issue are you passionate about? What really fires you up? What injustice makes you want to stand up and say, enough is enough?
And maybe even more importantly, what's one small thing you can do today to help that cause? Remember, it doesn't have to be huge. Even something simple like an act of kindness, a conversation with a friend, or donating to an organization you believe in can make a difference.
Wilberforce's story shows us that we all have the power to make things better. So go out there and be a force for good. You never know, maybe someday someone will be doing a deep dive on your life, amazed by the impact you made on the world.